I currently work at Starbucks and have been there for nearly a year. I'm a part-time employee, working all sorts of shifts during our operating hours. The Starbucks location I work at is what I'd call an average one. It's situated near a shopping area with a handful of other stores and restaurants nearby. This is a story about something that truly unnerved me, an experience that happened several months ago. On this particular day, I was scheduled for a closing shift. I remember clocking in at around noon, which meant I had an 8-hour shift ahead of me since we closed at 8 p.m. The afternoons here were usually slow until about 4 or 5 when business picked up for a few hours. By 7, things would typically quiet down again. The first few hours of my shift that day dragged on because we weren't too busy. Inside the store, we have several tables where customers often sit to work on their laptops or read. A few people were scattered around, sipping their coffee as they studied or worked. By 5 o'clock, the usual rush had arrived, and that's when I first noticed a man who immediately struck me as odd. He had a full beard, not extremely long but noticeably thick. He was balding and dressed in baggy, somewhat disheveled clothes. What made him stand out, though, was his behavior. He started pacing through the cafe at a brisk speed, as if he had somewhere to be, only to suddenly turn around and retrace his steps. It wasn't just wandering. It looked like he was speed-walking laps around the store over and over again. It was unsettling, to say the least. After about a minute or so of this strange pacing, he finally stopped and appeared to strike up a conversation with someone sitting nearby. At that point, I got caught up with my work and had little time to pay attention to him for the next 30 minutes or so. However, I soon overheard some of the customers complaining. When I glanced up, I saw that the man was still there, now sitting alone at a table, scanning the room. Apparently, he had been approaching people, either asking them to buy him something or even requesting their drinks. After discussing it with a coworker, it was decided that I should ask him to leave since I had the least amount of work at that moment. I felt a bit nervous because I wasn't sure how he would react. I stepped out from behind the counter and made my way toward where I had last seen him sitting. The store was still fairly busy, with people scattered about, talking and moving around. Our Starbucks is slightly larger than most, so there were plenty of places for him to be. But when I reached the table, he was gone. I frowned and did a quick walk around the store, scanning every corner. Strangely enough, I couldn't spot him anywhere. At that point, I assumed he had left, and honestly, I felt relieved. I returned behind the counter and got back to making drinks, my mind easing a little. By then, it was somewhere between 6 and 7 p.m., and things inside the cafe had started to settle down. At 7, a few of my coworkers clocked out, leaving just 4 of us to handle the last hour. The final hour of a closing shift always felt like the slowest, dragging on endlessly. By then, the store was usually quiet, and exhaustion from the long shift started settling in. We didn't get many customers during that time, so it often felt like we were just waiting for the clock to run out. Finally, 8 o'clock rolled around and the store was empty. Not a single customer remained at any of the tables. Like always, one of us had to go out and sweep the floor before locking up, so I grabbed the broom and started my routine. However, as I made my way toward the back of the store where the restrooms were located, something caught my attention. One of the bathroom doors was closed. We had 2 single-use bathrooms positioned across from each other in a small hallway at the back. The doors always remained open when unoccupied, so a closed door meant someone was inside. Immediately, my stomach tightened. My thoughts flashed back to the man from earlier. Was he still here? Hiding? Somehow, I just knew. My heart pounded as I knocked on the door, but there was no response. I waited a few seconds, then knocked again, this time speaking up. "We're closing now. Anyone in there?" Silence. No response at all. I frowned. Maybe someone had closed the door on their way out. That seemed possible. Still, something didn't sit right. I knocked a 3rd time, pressing my ear close, straining to hear any sound, any movement. But there was nothing. The stillness sent a chill through me. I took a slow step back, uncertainty creeping in. Then, out of nowhere, the door burst open, and sure enough, The man from earlier suddenly came charging out of the bathroom, sprinting straight toward me. Panic surged through my body as I instinctively turned and bolted. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. My co-workers, hearing the commotion, saw me dart past them in full flight. I didn't stop until I had cleared the building and was outside in the parking lot. But the man wasn't far behind, probably only about 10 feet away. He was relentless, and I had no idea how far he intended to chase me. Desperation set in as I realized I wouldn't make it to my car in time. My only option was to veer off toward another parking lot nearby, where there was a grocery store. I threw myself into a full sprint, barely able to catch my breath. My legs burned, but I didn't stop, not until I was inside the store. Thankfully, it was still open, and I dashed through the doors just as I heard the heavy footsteps of the man behind me slow down. At some point during my mad dash, I lost sight of him, but I didn't dare let my guard down. I had no idea when or if he had stopped chasing me, but the moment I was inside that grocery store, I finally felt a sliver of relief. As I caught my breath, my phone rang. My coworker was calling. I quickly answered, and she asked if I was okay. She also told me that they had already called the police. "I'm fine," I said, though I had no idea where the man was now. I slowly and carefully made my way back to Starbucks, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, keeping an eye out for the man. I was too scared to be relaxed. As I approached the store, I saw a police car parked outside. The officers spoke with all of us, and they said they would search the area for the man. We finished cleaning up the store, and after a while, everyone left for the night. Despite knowing the police were searching for him, the experience left me shaken, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease even as I left. It had certainly been the scariest day I'd ever had working at Starbucks. Last month, I went to Starbucks and had the worst experience of my life there. The thing is, I've been to that location probably 100 times before. I'm a huge coffee drinker. I have coffee every morning before work and continue drinking it throughout the day. That said, I don't go to Starbucks every day. Sometimes I brew my own coffee at home, and other times I check out different coffee spots depending on my mood or convenience. But on this particular day, I chose Starbucks. As I pulled into the parking lot, I immediately noticed the drive-through line was insanely long, stretching so far back that it barely seemed to move. Figuring I could save some time, I opted to park and go inside instead. However, once I stepped in, I quickly realized that wasn't going to be much faster either. There were at least 10 people inside. About 3 or 4 were in line to order, while the rest stood around waiting for their drinks. After me, there were still about 5 people waiting for their drinks. At this point, I was starting to feel a little anxious. I really needed to get to work, and I hadn't expected this to take so long. Finally, after what felt like forever, one of the Starbucks employees set a drink down on the counter and called my name. I should mention that my name is Jessica, and the drink matched exactly what I had ordered. The same size, the same details, everything. Relieved, I started walking toward the counter to grab it, but just as I was about to reach for my drink, a woman suddenly cut right in front of me. She hadn't even been directly behind me in line. She had just ordered minutes ago. There was no way this was her drink. I stood there in disbelief, watching as she confidently picked it up and started heading for the exit like it was hers. Something about the way she did it made it clear she wasn't just confused. She knew exactly what she was doing. I wasn't going to let it slide. I quickly followed her and caught up just before she reached the door. "Excuse me," I said, trying to stay calm. "I think that's my drink." She turned around with an annoyed glare, as if I was the one inconveniencing her. "No, it's mine," she snapped. I raised an eyebrow. "My name is Jessica. I ordered before you, and this is exactly what I ordered." The woman huffed and then, without missing a beat, said, "Well, my name is Jessica too, and I'm in a hurry." That was a lie. I could tell. So I asked, "Oh, really? What did you order?" Instead of answering, she simply held out the cup toward me with a smug look, like that was proof enough. But she never actually said the drink's name, which only confirmed my suspicion. Before I could argue further, she turned away and started walking out the door. At this point, I glanced back at the counter. The employees were still swamped, frantically taking orders and making drinks. The last thing I wanted was to hold up the line by making them remake mine. Plus, I was already running late. I let out a frustrated sigh and said, "Fine, take it then." With that, I turned around and headed for my car, deciding I'd just make a pot of coffee once I got to work. It wasn't the end of the world, but the whole situation irritated me. The sheer audacity of this woman, cutting in front of me, taking my drink and being so rude about it, really got under my skin. To my surprise, though, as I reached my car, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see the same woman standing there, glaring at me. "How dare you accuse me of stealing?" she snapped. "I haven't stolen a thing in my life." I rolled my eyes. "Look, I have to go. I don't have time to argue with you." I turned away, hoping that would be the end of it. But she wasn't done. She kept talking, her voice getting louder, but I ignored her. I got into my car, shut the door, and went to start the engine. That's when it happened. "Here, take your stupid drink," she suddenly shouted. Before I could react, she ripped the lid off the cup and dumped the entire drink all over my windshield. I just sat there stunned. For a few seconds, I didn't even know how to respond. Who does something like that over a coffee? By the time I looked up, she was already storming off in the other direction. With a sigh, I turned on my windshield wipers and let them smear the coffee away as best as they could. Then, shaking my head, I pulled out of the parking spot and headed toward the exit. As I reached the end of the lot, waiting to merge into traffic, I suddenly heard the screech of brakes behind me. A loud honk followed. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and sure enough, it was her. She was right behind me, glaring through her windshield, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I had no idea what her problem was, but she wasn't done making my morning miserable. When I finally merged onto the road, she tailed me aggressively, driving way too close. Every few seconds, she would lay on her horn, making sure I knew she was still there. This went on for miles. It was beyond ridiculous. Finally, she swerved around me, cutting dangerously close. As she sped past, she made sure to flip me off before disappearing into the distance. By the time I got to work, I didn't even need coffee anymore. The entire encounter had woken me up more than caffeine ever could. I made a fresh pot anyway, mostly out of routine, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. I didn't go back to that Starbucks for a while after that. Eventually, though, I did. I never saw that woman again, but I really hope she doesn't pull something like that on someone else. A few years ago, when I was in college, I had an unsettling experience that still sticks with me. It happened during finals week, a stressful time when I had to buckle down and focus on studying for my exams. Between my apartment, which I shared with my roommate, and campus, there was a Starbucks that I sometimes used as a study spot. I found that I could concentrate better there than in my apartment, plus the caffeine boost helped me stay alert. One particular morning, I decided to go there to study. It was late in the morning, well past the rush hour, so the place was relatively quiet. A few other students were scattered around, typing away on laptops or flipping through textbooks. I grabbed a table, set up my books and notes, then went up to order a drink before settling in to study. An hour or two passed, and I was still engrossed in my work, barely paying attention to anything around me. That's when, out of nowhere, a man approached my table. He was tall, somewhat thin, and significantly older than me. He waved briefly as if to get my attention, then stood across from me. "What are you working on?" he asked. I glanced up and told him I was studying for my final exams, keeping my response polite but short. He then asked if he could buy me a drink. I smiled and declined, pointing out that I already had one. "But you're finished with it," he said. He wasn't wrong, the cup was empty, but it wasn't transparent, so I had no idea how he could tell. Still, I repeated that I was fine and didn't need another. He lingered for a few moments before walking away without another word. Feeling slightly unsettled, I tried to refocus on my work, but something made me glance up a few seconds later. The man had taken a seat in the far corner of the cafe, but he wasn't just sitting. He was staring at me. Our eyes met briefly before I quickly looked back at my laptop. Over the next little while, I kept catching him watching me, and my discomfort grew. Eventually, I decided to call it a day. I had studied a good amount anyway, so I packed up and left, heading straight back to my apartment. That night, after my roommate returned, I continued studying in my room. I had an exam in the morning and another the following day, so I wanted to be well prepared. Around 10 p.m., feeling exhausted, I decided to get ready for bed. Just as I was about to turn in, there was a knock at our apartment door. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was one of my roommate's friends dropping by. She and I got along well, but we didn't always keep track of each other's plans. However, when she came into my room and asked if I was expecting anyone, I told her no. "Well, there's some guy standing outside our door," she said, a note of unease in her voice. We both walked to the kitchen, which faced the front door. I peeked through the peephole, and my stomach dropped. It was the same man from Starbucks. I quickly stepped back, my pulse racing. My roommate, noticing my reaction, asked who he was. I whispered about my encounter with him earlier that day, but I had no idea how he had found out where we lived. We didn't answer the door, but he knocked again. And again. The minutes dragged on, each knock making my skin crawl. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, probably around 10 minutes, before finally leaving. That night I barely slept. Luckily, he didn't return. The next morning I went to campus, took my exam, and came back home to study for the one I had the next day. This time, though, I was alone. My roommate was out. At around 5 p.m., just as I was reviewing my notes, a knock sounded at the front door. My stomach tightened as I walked over to check. Peering through the peephole, I felt my blood run cold. It was him. Again. The next time he showed up, he was even more persistent. This time, his knocking was louder and faster, almost as if he knew I was inside and was growing frustrated that I wasn't answering. I could feel the pressure building as I stood there, listening. My heart raced as I realized he wasn't just knocking. He was trying to open the door. Thankfully, it was locked, but the idea of him trying to break in made me feel sick with fear. My mind raced with terrifying thoughts. What if he actually tried to force his way in? What was I supposed to do? I quickly grabbed my phone and called my roommate. I explained the situation, telling her that the guy was back and I was getting scared. She said she was on her way home, but I didn't want her to encounter him alone. I could hear the panic in my own voice as I warned her to be careful. Meanwhile, he didn't knock again. Instead, he just stood there, staring at the door. The minutes dragged on, each second making me feel more uneasy. I couldn't stop watching, hoping he would leave, but he didn't. It felt like an eternity, but finally, after what seemed like 10 minutes or more, he walked away. I immediately told my roommate he was gone. She arrived soon after, but neither of us felt safe in the apartment anymore. We were shaken, and the idea of staying there alone seemed impossible. Fortunately, some friends of ours lived not too far away, in a house near campus. We decided to head there for the night. They had plenty of space, and we both felt safer being with others. At our friend's house, we managed to relax for a bit, but the fear of the man returning still lingered in the back of our minds. He didn't show up there, though, which was a relief. I ended up staying at our friend's place for the next 2 days. I didn't want to go back to the apartment, not after everything that had happened. When my parents came up to help me move out, I was almost relieved. I was glad to be leaving the apartment, but part of me was still haunted by how the man had found us. How had he known where I lived? He must have followed me after I left the Starbucks, but that realization only made my skin crawl. I still have no idea how he got our address, and the thought of it makes me uneasy even now. I'm just grateful that I haven't seen him since. I don't know what his intentions were, but I'm thankful I never had to find out. A few years ago, I worked at a Starbucks coffee shop, though it was only for a couple of months. One night, as we were approaching closing time, I was on shift with just one other coworker. I don't remember the exact closing hour, but I believe it was around 8 or 9 p.m. At that time, there was only one customer inside. He had been there for quite a while, sitting at a table, focused on his laptop while sipping his coffee. We gave him a heads up that we'd be closing soon, and he nodded, assuring us he'd leave before then. The Starbucks location where I worked wasn't particularly busy. It was somewhat isolated, not directly next to any other businesses. There wasn't a strip mall or any neighboring stores immediately nearby, though there were a few located a couple of miles down the road. With just 5 minutes left until closing, something strange happened. Out of nowhere, a figure suddenly appeared at one of the front windows. It was a man wearing a creepy alien mask. I was the first to notice him, and I quickly pointed him out to my coworker. At first we chuckled, assuming it was just someone goofing around. But to be honest, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling creeping over me. Then, without warning, the masked man banged on the window, hard. The force of it was so intense that I was almost surprised the glass didn't shatter. That's when the situation stopped feeling like a harmless joke. The lone customer, still working on his laptop, turned toward us with a puzzled expression and muttered something like, "What the heck is that?" Before we could react, the masked man pressed his face and hands right up against the window, staring directly at us. His presence was unsettling, and at that moment, the atmosphere inside the cafe shifted completely. My left side was fairly close to the entrance doors, and I decided it was time to lock up. I walked over and announced that I was locking the doors since we were closing in 3 minutes. I had no idea what this guy was up to, and I didn't want to take any chances. As I turned the lock, the man in the alien mask remained where he was, still staring inside with an eerie stillness. Meanwhile, my coworker and the customer began talking in hushed tones, trying to figure out what the guy outside wanted, and who he even was. The strange thing was that we hadn't seen him arrive. From where we stood, we had a clear view of nearly the entire parking lot through the windows, yet the only cars out there were mine, my coworkers, and the customers. After locking the doors, I headed back behind the counter, joining my coworker as we kept a watchful eye on the masked man. He lingered there for another minute or so, staring in at us without moving. Then, suddenly, he stepped toward the entrance and grabbed the door handle, attempting to push his way inside. When he realized it was locked, he responded by pounding on the glass with both hands. The sound echoed through the empty cafe, making my chest tighten. I immediately walked over and shouted at him that we were closed, demanding to know what he wanted. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, blocking the entrance, refusing to budge. By now, the customer inside had packed up his laptop and was ready to go. But before stepping away from his seat, he hesitated and said, "I know you guys are closed, but I'm not leaving with that guy standing right there." We reassured him that he wasn't alone. We weren't about to leave either until the masked man was gone. Minutes passed, dragging on like hours, and the situation was getting more ridiculous by the second. I decided to take a more direct approach, stepping toward the doors once more and firmly telling the man to leave. But as soon as I moved closer, he responded by slamming his fists against the door even harder than before. The force of it sent a jolt through me. Keeping my voice steady, I warned him that if he didn't leave, we'd have no choice but to call the police. I didn't want it to come to that, but I had no idea how else to get rid of him. Surprisingly, my words seemed to have some effect. After a brief pause, he stopped banging on the glass, but instead of leaving, he simply resumed pressing his masked face and hands against the window, watching us in silence. We all just stood there, waiting, not sure what he would do next. After about 5 more minutes, just as I was seriously considering making that call to the police, the man finally moved. Without warning, he straightened up and walked away as if nothing had happened. We all breathed a sigh of relief. The customer wasted no time heading out the door, followed by my coworker and then me. We scanned the parking lot and the surrounding area, but the man had seemingly vanished into the night. None of us had any clue where he had come from or where he had gone. As my coworker and the customer quickly drove off, I stayed back for an extra minute, texting my mom about the bizarre and unsettling encounter before heading home. Just as I was about to put my phone down and start the car, my stomach dropped. When I glanced up, The same masked man was standing just 10 feet away, walking straight toward my vehicle. Panic surged through me and I wasted no time. I slammed the car into reverse and sped out of the lot as fast as I could. But as I pulled away, I saw him in my rearview mirror. He had broken into a full sprint, chasing after me all the way to the edge of the parking lot. My heart pounded as I pressed harder on the gas, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. Thankfully, he never caught up. I escaped that night, and I never saw him again. To this day, I still wonder what his true intentions were. Was he just some deranged prankster who took things way too far? Or was he someone far more dangerous, with plans we were lucky enough to never discover? I guess I'll never know, and honestly, I'm glad I never had to find out. It was a bright and sunny Saturday morning when I decided to head to Starbucks for my usual coffee fix. At the time, I was around 18 years old and still living with my parents in a fairly average neighborhood. Our local Starbucks was just a quick 5-minute drive away, making it a convenient stop. I don't remember the exact time I arrived, but the place had its usual weekend atmosphere. Calm, with a handful of people scattered around, sitting at tables and chatting quietly. I walked inside, ordered my usual drink, and waited briefly before picking it up. In total, I spent maybe 5 minutes inside before heading back out into the parking lot. The moment I stepped outside, the warmth of the sun hit my face as I made my way toward my car. I got in, started the engine, and began driving home. The Starbucks was located right on the edge of a residential area, so the streets leading home were mostly lined with houses. As soon as I pulled out of the parking lot, I noticed another car pulling out right behind me. At first, I didn't think anything of it. It was a busy enough area for that to be normal. But when I made my next turn, the same car followed. It wasn't just that it turned after me. The way it did was sharp and abrupt, almost like the driver had just made a last-second decision. That was when I started paying attention. Still, I brushed it off, thinking it was all just a coincidence. I continued driving, and as I reached my street, the car turned in as well. That's when a small feeling of unease crept in. What were the chances that this random car just happened to be going the exact same way as me? I pulled into my driveway, hoping that would settle it. The car, however, slowed down significantly but didn't follow me in. Instead, it kept moving down the street at a slow pace before finally driving away. I shook off the weird feeling and went inside, pushing the thought to the back of my mind. Maybe it really was just a coincidence. Hours passed, and I spent the rest of the day at home with nothing to do. Later that night, we decided to order pizza, and my brother volunteered me to go pick it up. I wasn't too thrilled about it, but I grabbed my keys and headed out. The pizza place was farther away than Starbucks, so it would take a bit longer. I backed out of the driveway, started driving down my street, and that's when I saw it again, the same car. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't coming from a random direction this time. It was coming from right past our house. That's when I knew something wasn't right. Who was this person, and why were they still around? Trying to stay calm, I decided to test something. Instead of heading straight to the pizza place, I suddenly took a left at the next turn, then another left. I kept making random turns, creating a loop that would eventually lead me back to my street. My goal was to see if the car would still be there when I returned. When I reached my street again, I sped up and quickly pulled into our driveway. I parked as close to the house as possible, threw open my door, and sprinted up the front yard to the door. As I reached the porch, I turned back just in time to see the car speeding away, disappearing down the street once again. Breathless, I rushed inside and immediately told my dad everything. I mentioned how I had seen the same car earlier in the day and that I was sure I was being followed. He didn't waste any time. He grabbed his keys and decided to go pick up the pizza himself instead. When he got back, he told me that he hadn't seen the car anywhere during his drive. For the next few days, I refused to leave the house alone. But eventually, life went back to normal. I never saw the car again. Even now, I still think about that day. Who was driving that car? And what did they want?